Welcome to the Trump presidency. This is our third class of this semester. We present this class on the man, his policies, and his foes. It's sometimes hard because of the volume of intentional news and intentional, almost celebrity outreach sometimes the president does to get by the man. But I try to get into the other two in the course of the program. Some housekeeping items. I know it's raining today, and thank you for being here. Those of you who drove like me, we had a tree across our road on the other side of the street. We're glad to get here. We don't know how we're going to get home, but we're glad to get here. Please silence your cell phones. We got the mailing list. You can sign outside. Okay, episode 3. This is our Valentine's Day edition. Look to someone who's your Valentine's and say, well, you know what to say. You know what to say. And if it's inappropriate, wait until after this class. We want no reports to Patsy on someone doing an inappropriate wish today. We checked.
Mentioning it is not PC.
We checked with Florist FTD today, and I showed my wife I only had one set of flowers being delivered to our daughter today. She's taken the position that, it's a waste of money otherwise. And I still am competing with her husband, not my wife's. My daughter's husband. But we decided this year to go lower so that he obviously wins the flower contest, but enough so that he knows that he has a father-in-law who loves his wife. We're remaining in living history. There are so many things that can happen in this presidency that are both traditional and unique to make this a moment of living history. To Americans. We'll do as we do normally. We talk about things that have happened since we last met. We talk about the president and the presidency, the checks and balances from the various branches of government, the presidential agenda now in the next month, and then we'll look at what's happening as the campaign starts in earnest. We have more Democratic candidates. Some Republican candidates are itching towards declaring their candidacy. We'll talk about some of those because you'll be hearing a lot about them, and we'll do some background in some of those, particularly if we have time. And then I have something at the end I want to do. So what are the big news? Well, we still don't know at this hour, at least according to the Twitter news feed. We don't know the president's intent. Is he going to sign if the Congress gets him the bill on the border security and the other agencies that were subject to the government shutdown, the longest government shutdown in American history? Will he sign the bill? We don't even know yet will pass the House of Representatives today. Because some on the right and some on the left are opposing it. The chairman of the Progressive Caucus came out against the bill, said it didn't do enough to curb the ICE, and it should have been a limitation on the number of de facto arrests ICE could do. Those on the right said it doesn't have all the money the president wants, and it has none of the changes in the immigration law that the right would like. So we'll see if the broad center will hold on a bill, on this conference report. The president says he doesn't like the bill, but there will be no government shutdown. But if there is, blame the Democrats. So you try to make out what that means. I'm not happy. There won't be a shutdown, but if there's a shutdown, blame them. So we'll still see. The bill is now, I think, it's come into, from the conceptual agreement to the actual bill form. The House Rules Committee is waiving the rule that a bill has to be in the same shape for 72 hours before a vote. That's a good government reform, to have a bill that you actually can see and read, except when the government is about to shut down. Now some say, and we may hear that later on today, that maybe you do a 3-day extension of the government for that. But we'll see. I think the leadership certainly wants the bill to be voted on. There's a thing in Washington, D.C. That goes like this. There are Democrats, there are Republicans, and there are appropriators. And what they mean by that is the members of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. They have learned from dealing with money, one of the easiest things to deal with, actually, how to make compromises. And appropriators are known for that. And I think Speaker Pelosi really wanted to force this issue not into some type of super committee on immigration and border security, but into a standard committee of the Congress, and got it in before the appropriators. And 4 people actually did the principal negotiations, 2 from the House and 2 from the Senate, and then they took it back to their committees, took it back to their leaderships, and got the sign-off to go forward. The president, from a lot of reports, the White House was very little involved in the deal, except at the beginning saying they were engaging in a waste of time. Very little in actually going there. Before, in the previous shutdown, the vice president was frequently over meeting with congressional leaders. Jared Kushner was over extensively trying to cut the deal, as in his mind being the premier deal maker in the administration, and we got a government shutdown. Now, not everyone likes the conference report, because by its very nature, a conference report is a compromise when one party holds office and another party is in power. See if I can get the sound on in this.
But first, the border wall becomes a border stall.
We need to tackle what is a garbage new compromise, supposedly, surrounding border security. In tonight's Hannity Watch on building the wall.
Something that I'm sure the president doesn't like to hear among some of his normally strongest supporters. Here's what it does in terms of the wall itself. We currently have a border that you can place a wall on of approximately 1,000 miles. You have barriers now of about 654 miles. Effectively, this legislation would continue to allow the replacement of existing walls, either when they fall down or when you want to replace them. Plus, it would add another 55 miles in the southern border in the Texas area. The president has talked about, and his chief of staff and the vice president talked about, well, there's other sources of money. And in talking to former Congressman Tom Campbell last week, when we went over and did an hour and 10-minute interview with him, he thought, and in an article he had in Tuesday's Orange County Register, Campbell, former congressman, law professor, former Supreme Court clerk. Father was the chief judge of the court, federal court in the Chicago area. Before that, his father was a U.S. attorney who prosecuted Frank Nitti. As he thought that the president had enough authority to transfer money without declaring a state of emergency. He said the Congress could block that, but the president could then veto any legislation blocking it. So he wondered, he was a little bit troubled why he hadn't done that up to this point. But we had earlier this showdown on the border. And of all places, one of the first places I learned to drive was in El Paso, Texas. And I remember making a right turn that went over the curb. And my wife, to this day, kind of pulls me back from curbs because of crazy drivers. I was that driver, but I wasn't 72 then. I think I was 17 then in El Paso. And the president spoke. Let's see if we can get this video going here.
We know that walls do not save lives. Walls end lives. We stand for America and we stand against walls. We know that there is no bargain in which we can sacrifice some of our humanity to gain a little more security.
And here's President Trump laying into the Texan.
We were all challenged by a young man who lost an election to Ted Cruz. Hey, you're supposed to win in order to run. But a young man who's got very little going for himself, except he's got a great first name. He challenged us. So we have, let's say, 35,000 people tonight, and he has 200 people, 300 people.
We'll talk about that. So the president went there to deliver a message. The former congressman from that area who ran for Congress and lost to Ted Cruz, but got more votes for Democrats than I think any state U.S. Senate candidate since Ann Richards was governor, led a march in opposition to the president speaking. But the president likes numbers. But in one sense, I think O'Rourke, this is my opinion, kind of threw the president off. It became, instead of talking about the wall, which he did, but he went after the former local congressman and the highest profile Democrat in Texas and got diverted from his message. And then he had this funny comment that, O'Rourke is only having 200 or 300 people. We have 30,000. Well, here's the problem. Let me tell you. Here's the problem. The stadium in which the president was speaking, because the Secret Service wants an enclosed area which they can secure, can't hold more than 6,000 people. And like 5,800, 5,900. And the police in El Paso estimated the other crowd at 10,000. They have 300 and you have 30,000. And of course, some of the after talk about that was not on what the president went to El Paso to say, but by the size of the crowd. And some of the conservative press, particularly a Wall Street Journal, basically says, Mr. President, this is not your issue, government shutdown versus border wall. Declare victory and move on. Remember the U.S. Senator one time said during the Vietnam War to Nixon, we should declare war and get out. And maybe for the same impulse. The Wall Street Journal called the shutdown versus wall a budget box canyon that you don't get out of if you keep going in that path. Some say the Congress is so convinced at this point, I mean the majority, the vast majority, maybe 80 or 90% of members of the Congress, both the House and the Senate, that government shutdowns are poor negotiating leverage, whether it be the Democrats when they tried to do it in the Senate on the Dreamer legislation, or now the Republicans in a couple of instances. One, when they didn't control the White House, and now when they do control the White House. That some in the Congress want to pass a law that prohibits shutdowns. And how do you do that? Well, you basically continue funding at a certain level. Now, trying to get what that formula is may prevent a law preventing a shutdown. In one way, there shouldn't be. I mean, the democratic process of representative government is designed, this is how you reconcile problems. You get together, you hit a compromise. And if you have a problem with that, win the election. Win the next election. Now, at the same time the wall controversy was going on, our governor, our new governor, Gavin Newsom, had his State of the State address. I mean, everyone has a state of something. I'm going to do a State of the Marriage address someday. Well, my wife is going to give a State of the Marriage one. And that is, you know, State of the Union, State of the State, State of the City, State of the School District, State of the County, State of the Sanitation District, I don't know, State of the School District. They're all valid. The governor said he was pulling back our troops from the border that was sent by Governor Brown, until you find out that the troops are less than 400 troops to begin with, and they're going to other missions that were aligned to the original intent that Governor Brown sent them to, plus some stuff that deals with the fire threat in the forested areas of California. Now, we still have that drama to come out of. What will happen in terms of border security versus government shutdown? It is a little bit surprising, to say a PS on that the president never got any funding to expand the wall when there was a Republican Congress. And it took a Democratic Congress to get partial funding of it. Just interesting how the process is. When the Republicans took control of both houses, they were obviously not prepared to implement the president's vision right away, because they could have prioritized it. They spent a lot of time prioritizing the tax cut and the health law changes or repeal. But on that, when they had clearly an ability to get the bill through, they didn't. And it's ironic where we are at this point. State of the Union, big thing, big thing. Why it's a big thing? Well, this is why it's a big thing. The Constitution. Now, the Constitution calls upon the president from time to time to communicate with the Congress. That's basically what it is, on the status of things. And that can be done in writing. As a matter of fact, James Madison both wrote the initial draft and maybe the complete draft of George Washington's initial written address to the Congress, and then he wrote the Congress's response back to the president, something that Congress really, I think, stopped doing at some point in our history. So there is no requirement that the president comes before Congress and provides the message. Some did, some didn't. It was stopped by Thomas Jefferson, who was not, when John Adams did speak, when Thomas Jefferson would come and was not a good speaker and decided he didn't want to speak. He's a good writer, so he wrote his own message over there. Then go forward, and some did and some didn't, until you get to Woodrow Wilson, who was this great speaker You know, probably the father of American political science, or at least American public administration. There's a lot of things you can like and dislike about Wilson, but he was a good speaker, and he was convinced that he could persuade anyone of anything related to government. And so he came back before the Congress. FDR, towards the end of his life, forego the last one, just said a message over. This is George Washington's first State of the Union that he sent over to Congress. I know you can't read that very well, but his handwriting looks better than mine. So what about this guy, our president? Well, part of the State of the Union now is this, I don't know, is it a kabuki dance? Who's a good person? You're a good person in performing arts. What would you call this dance? When it's a very ritualized dance that occurs, you have the president addressing. This is a beautiful, historic body, the floor of the House of Representatives, where you have both the House and the Senate, the diplomatic corps, the cabinet, except for the designated survivor. And who was the designated survivor this time? Who? Yes, Perry, the Energy Secretary. And you have this some members of the Supreme Court. You have the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is the place, as you know, from the series called Designated Survivor. If you're going to blow up the government, this is a place that is ground zero. And you have on one side one party, and they keep getting up and down and up and down and up and down. They're so enthusiastic for their guy and one day their gal to applaud, sometimes in the middle of a phrase. Sometimes in the middle of a phrase. And then you have the other side. You know, unless there was a fire drill, you got the sense that group was not going to stand up. They did, but this, you just flip it with parties and the whole roles changes to not applauding. And so you could see the president emphasize one side of the room more than the other side. Nothing worse than a public speaker when they find, like sometimes in this group, that person's sleeping, that person's sleeping, but that you're not getting any response at all. So we have this ritualized activity. And why do we do it? Not only the Constitution, it is to lay out the president's vision for where he wants the country to go in the next year and thereafter, and what he wants from Congress to assist him in that, whether it be moral support, whether it be legislation, whether it be adulation. In recent years, they haven't gotten adulation from both sides of the aisle. The closest it came was right after 9/11, when President Bush came before Congress. But that was on a very special note. So the president appealed to unity, which some saw as ironic. Let's remember how that was and see if these excerpts go well. Okay, here we go up.
President Trump is not really a conventional politician, so he doesn't often give very conventional speeches. But in his State of the Union address on Tuesday night, he sort of did that. It was a fairly conventional State of the Union address. It had the usual calls for unity and bipartisanship that you tend to expect in State of the Union speeches.
Now is the time for bipartisan action. Believe it or not, we have already proven that that's possible.
It did not have, though, a long laundry list of legislative desires and an agenda of things that he wants to do with Congress. It had a few of those things, but it was sort of lacking in some of those specifics. The Question then becomes, what should you take away from that speech? Well, I think there are three things in particular. The first is the president tried to strike a different tone overall than the one that's predominated here in Washington over the last month, since the beginning of the year, when Democrats took control of the House and introduced divided government. Up until Tuesday night, the atmosphere had been one of insults and fights, a shutdown of the government for most of that period, and not much communication between the two parties. The president tried to change that Tuesday night. He talked about achieving great things together, talked about how a victory for America is more important than a victory for either party.
Victory is not winning for our party. Victory is winning for our country.
It was an attempt, at least, to change the tone in Washington. We'll see how successful it is. The second takeaway is that immigration remains the great subject of divide in Washington. You know, the tensest part of the speech was a 15-minute block right in the middle of it when the president moved into a long conversation about the evils of illegal immigration, the need for the border wall that he wants, that Democrats consider unnecessary, a waste of money, and immoral.
Now is the time for Congress to show the world that America is committed to ending illegal immigration and putting the ruthless coyotes, cartels, drug dealers, and human traffickers out of business.
Talking about how illegal immigrants bring crime, drugs, murder into the country, drive down wages for American workers. A lot of things that Democrats tend to think are demonization of immigrants. And not much in any of that tells you how they're going to resolve what is a continuing dispute about building that wall along the southern border that President Trump wants. That could still shut down the government, at least in part, in 10 more days. I don't think we emerged any more certain of how that dispute is going to be resolved. There was a hint in which the president might have suggested a compromise in which he talked about building a wall not from one end of the border to the other, but only in parts of the border where experts think it's necessary. Maybe that's his hint of a compromise, but I think at the end of the night, we still aren't sure how this gets resolved.
This is a smart, strategic, see-through steel barrier, not just a simple concrete wall. It will be deployed in the areas identified by the border agents as having the greatest need. And these agents will tell you where walls go up, illegal crossings go way, way down.
And finally, I think the one item where there seems to be the best prospect of bipartisan achievement this year is infrastructure spending. We've talked about that in the past. President Trump wants infrastructure spending. Democrats like infrastructure spending. Unions want it. Big city mayors want it. He talked about it. The Democrats applauded.
And I am eager to work with you on legislation to deliver new and important infrastructure investment, including investments in the cutting-edge industries of the future.
And oh, by the way, infrastructure spending is possible because of something the president didn't mention, the federal budget deficit. It's going to reach nearly $1 trillion this year. It's going to go over $1 trillion in subsequent years. In theory, that might stop Congress and the president from finding money to spend on infrastructure, but nobody seems to care about borrowing money and driving up the deficit.
So a somewhat sobering piece. And what happens usually after the president's State of the Union is that his ratings go up, and we'll see that later on. But a lot of attention this time was on the speaker. Speaker Pelosi seemed to be very adept at keeping her members within a certain choir range. That when they got restlessness, she was like a school teacher or a mom that tried to quiet people down. And she gave the handshake her kids said was what she gave them when she disapproved of them. And her one of her 5 children pointed that out later on, that there was a lot of mannerisms that the speaker uses that with the president and members of her caucus that she used to use on them as children. The The response came from Stacey Abrams from Georgia, who lost a very narrow election for Congress in a state that Democrats weren't really encouraged by their election chances. She talked about a whole range of things, including that Democrats, in her view, wanted the president to secede when they do things for the benefit of America. She talked about voter suppression and lifting people up. And she immediately became a talk of the town of running for either the U.S. Senate in 2020 from Georgia, there's a seat up, or even for president. So she had a pretty good response to her talk, which is somewhat unusual. In recent years, the person who gave the other party's response were, on the late shows later on, comedy shows, as a point of ridicule. Remember last time when it was Robert Kennedy Jr. and he had something on his lip or something, and then the year before, who was it that had the water glass? Was that Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, and then Bobby Jindal, and it's a challenging role to try to rebut an incumbent president. The fact checkers from the news organizations pointed out, as they do in every politician's major speeches, that they might have either exaggerated, didn't tell all the facts, or were generally wrong, and they had several on the president. I won't go through all of them, but there are. This was from the Washington Post, not one of the president's favorite publications, but the Washington Post editorialized "The Drifting President. Mr. Trump offers a thin sheen of unity over large helpings of the same old polarizing demagoguery." The Wall Street Journal on the right took a little bit more positive approach, Trump's bipartisan pitch, but the subhead, or the summary head, was, "Alas, on immigration, he keeps preaching to the converted." Some commentators noted that the president had the opportunity to kind of change the debate on immigration to a broader canvas of issues, of changing how you deal with skill-based immigration, how do you expedite people from actually being considered for legal entry into the country, how do you do these things, but instead narrowed on the wall as his major focus and the crimes of immigrants caused in America. There's some statistics, and I haven't seen any statistics that disprove these, but they may very well exist. I'm sure someone has some that will have statistics that can rebut anything. But immigrants on the whole into America, and immigrants who are here undocumented in America, tend to commit crimes at a much lower rate than native-born Americans. And I think that's for a good reason. One, because how they got here, whether legally or illegally, and their status, if you're illegally, I think is a good limiting factor. Okay, let's talk about some of the other things. Sometimes we can miss the big picture of what's going on with the presidency. We are very close to ending the physical caliphate of ISIS. They're down to 1 square mile. That may be just a few days in which you just bomb out everyone. Coming in from all sides. Now that doesn't mean ISIS is over with. ISIS will just regenerate as a non-territorial terrorist organization, or will transform, no doubt, into a different, maybe even into a different organization that will be devil civilization for years to come. But ISIS is about to, their physical presence is about to disappear. The president will declare a victory. He'll talk about how he stepped up the number of bombings, removed many of the restrictions, the Obama-era restrictions that were on the bombing target. Obama had a much higher threshold against bombing with civilian casualties than the president. And I would expect the president will be talking in the next few weeks on the success in dealing with ISIS and claiming that it's always dangerous. I have eliminated terrorism. We'll see. We also had another great series of economic reports with the jobs numbers particularly strong and suggesting that some of the recession expectations may have been overblown. We'll see. The number of jobs added now, 205,000 a month for the last 2 years, which in the last 2 years, so that includes some of the Obama administration, is twice the replacement rate necessary as the population grows. The Wall Street Journal trying to point it out to those who would criticize the president on economic matters. They wrote a somewhat snarky editorial. Sorry for the good news. A bang up jobs report reveals underlying economic strength. Then we had this man, former Attorney General, now, recommended by the Senate Judiciary Committee, just a matter of a few days or hours away from confirmation from the full Senate as the next Attorney General, William Barr. That really is big news, as we know all that the Justice Department can and does do in our society and the quasi-independence of it. We also had the president following through on ending the intermediate nuclear missile pact with Russia, and we found very quickly thereafter that President Putin liked that idea. He liked the idea that they can continue to develop missiles. And the INF treaty didn't restrict China. It didn't restrict Iran. Didn't restrict North Korea. So you can make a good point that any step backwards from limiting the spread of nuclear-tipped missiles, any step backwards is a bad step. And a step closer to World War III. But you could also make a case, I believe, that at least that unfortunately the world is going to more missiles and newer missiles and more exotic missiles and harder to shoot down missiles in the years ahead. And that probably makes for an unsafer society unless there is that mutual deterrence, mutually assured destruction of the Cold War. So a lot of copy on that. The president also called for a couple of weeks ago a new missile defense. Remember President Reagan calling for what was then called Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative? And so far, we have made advances. But as many of the scientists and military people say, that shooting down a ballistic missiles is like shooting a bullet with another bullet. It is so difficult once it gets into the ballistic path. But it will mean a lot of money to defense contractors and others who want to try to do that. This is a survey of Americans on who do you trust to protect the U.S. national security. Number one, not surprisingly, the military. That's in green. Number 2 is the overall, is the intelligence community, the CIA, the NSA, the FBI. Number 3, the courts, of all things. Number 4, the president. And number 5, the Congress. I don't think too many people think Congress is going to be on the barricades on a war. They'll be in their nuclear bunker as well as the president and his nuclear bunkers. So I think we sometimes look at the politics and the gamesmanship of the moment in looking at any presidency, but we got some serious stuff going on now. Very serious stuff when you talk about the deployment, the additional deployment of nuclear weapons. Okay. The Wall Street Journal pointed out to the president that that his security policy, unless it includes alliances, is a security policy that is incomplete. And the president talked about ending endless wars and having long-lasting peaces. The Wall Street Journal argued in an editorial, we need troops abroad to deter war and bad actors. Peggy Noonan, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, former Reagan speechwriter, writing in the Wall Street Journal about 10 days ago, said this president hasn't been tested yet with a major international security event. And she is anxious about his ability to do so. Not necessarily intellectual ability, but how he processes things, which she talked about. In part, let me read this. How would this White House handle a grave crisis? It is right to feel particular concern. We know from every first-person account, from the histories, memoirs, and journalism, that it's a White House frequently at war, this one. They don't get along. They leak. They don't trust each other. There is unusually high turnover, a constantly changing cast of characters, a lack of deep experience. During the Berlin airlift, thought at the time to be the height of the Cold War, Secretary of State George Marshall, who had been Army Chief of Staff during World War II, was asked how worried he was. I've seen worse, he replied. He had. No one around this president has seen worse. When James Mattis, John Kelly, and H.R. McMaster left the administration, a cumulative 123 years of military and diplomatic experience left with him, and that goes on. So national security, we should keep an eye on that. Okay, let's talk about the man in the presidency. Well, there was this interesting article recently that John Dickerson then did a little column on, talked about the president's lack of time apparently doing the hard work of being the president. That his use of executive time, that many in his administration, go back to the last article about backbiting and leaks, say he's just watching television, maybe till 10 or 11 at a day, and then he comes in wanting to act on what he's seen on television. John Dickerson argues, and I have a video here, but I don't think I have time for it, so let me just note it's a good one. Look up John Dickerson of CBS on executive time, and he talks about it's important that presidents do have an opportunity to think, but how they use that thinking, rather than just reacting, can determine the success of the president and the success of America. So I encourage you to see that. The president spent a long time, or a appreciable time during the State of the Union, talking about late-term abortions. And that's a legitimate issue. And it is not only a policy issue, it's a political issue, as abortion has become, as reproductive rights has become, has unborn fetus or unborn baby time has come, depending upon your view on those things. But one thing is very clear. The president sees the evangelical community as essential to his reelection. And he seems to be engaged now in making sure his base is strong. We know that the states vary widely in how many weeks of gestation a fetus can have before it can no longer be aborted except for the health of the mother. And it varies greatly, and many states are reenacting their laws thinking the Supreme Court, probably with good reason, is going to strike down in one way or the other Roe versus Wade. So you see a lot of activities now, and the president's evangelical supporters and his political supporters see that they need to point out each change as something that may either motivate their supporters to stay with the president. Now, in Europe, my understanding from listening at least to one, I thought, fairly authoritative podcast, that the period of gestation is generally much lower than ours. More first trimester than the second trimester. So there's wide variations in how this works out. You can see an overlay on this chart between the number of period of viability and the limit of that viability in the various states. The red states are states Republican leaning, and blue states are Democratic leaning. Some states like California a fetus is determined viable but has no time frame set. The Supreme Court did something that some thought they weren't going to do. Matter of fact, with the new justices, Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, they thought the Supreme Court would uphold the Louisiana law that effectively restricted the number of abortion physicians in the clinics in the state to one. Now, it didn't say to one. It said that you have to have admitting rights to a nearby hospital in case something goes wrong, that you can follow the patient over to the hospital. Others say there's other emergency doctors in the hospital. They can handle that. Well, the Supreme Court hasn't settled the issue yet, but by a 5-4 vote, with the Chief Justice surprisingly on the more liberal, progressive side on this, decided to continue to enjoin Louisiana until the entire Supreme Court decides that issue. But I think the days of Roe versus Wade in many ways are numbered because of the justices that are now in the Supreme Court. Now, in the last election, exit polls show that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. That's a big constituency to him. One of the most polarized constituencies and strongest constituency for the president. And there was a lot of evidence that they turned out in record numbers. And then you have this in recent times. Is God on Team Trump? And you could make that case. You wouldn't make that case, but some are making that case. If I can get this going here. Oops, this is another one that is having a problem launching here. You're going to have to see what's Washington Post is having launch problems. But look at what the president is doing to support his evangelical base. He's appointed anti-abortion judges. He's called for a federal ban on late-term abortions. A federal ban instead of leaving it up to the state. Called for a repeal of the amendment that forbids churches from endorsing or imposing political candidates while remaining as a nonprofit organization, tax-exempt organization. has attempted to restrict abortions at facilities receiving federal funds. He continues to fund abstinence programs, which I think most of us would support. Promised to help religious adoption agency, praised the Bible literacy classes, and encouraged people to say Merry Christmas again. All those things are music to evangelicals. When you ask, do you believe God wanted Trump to be president? More than 50% of white evangelical and almost 50% of Republicans say yes. Now, part of that may be the perception of the role of religion and faith in your life. It can be that any outcome is God's wish. A disaster occurs, God's wish. You know, it happens. A child dies, God's wish. So that may be overstated by some on the left, but it does show you the strong faith-based feeling towards the president. By the way, Democrats and independents don't think that much that the president is, that God wanted Donald Trump to be president. But ask this guy.
The press is against him, so, you know, you read the Bible, and there was a point in there where God told Jeremiah, he said, tell them to take the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, and they didn't want to do it. And you read the Psalms, the second Psalm, which says, you know, why do the nations rage and imagine a vain thing, and they revolt against the Lord and his anointed? I think somehow the Lord's plan is being put in place for America, and these people are not only revolting against Trump, they're revolting against what God's plan is for America.
Some of you may not believe that. Some of you may believe that. Sarah Huckabee strongly said that she thought the president was God's messenger in his policies. How popular or unpopular is the president? Well, the president is still unpopular in the most recent series of polling data. In terms of, he has almost a 54% disapproval among people likely to vote. However, he's doing better now than he did a couple of weeks ago. He was at 42% approval a couple of weeks ago when we met. Now he was 43, now he's up at 44. So he's moved up a little bit. One thing Americans have been starting to talk more about, and that's global warming. I think the fires and some of the cataclysmic events elsewhere in America are suggesting to people that it may not be directly related to global warming, but that's the type of extreme climate changes that often is associated, and we ought to start paying more attention to that. And polling data strongly suggests that Americans say global warming is personally important by a margin of 72 to 28. Notice the number is down with Republicans. Well, it is down with Republicans. It's not on that poll, but it's down with Republicans, but up even higher with Democrats. 2018 was reported to be the fourth warmest year since 1880. And that's based upon data that is collected more reliably since that year. So that's increasingly becoming an issue the president will have to somehow address. What's the immediate agenda? Well, one is to get the Attorney General nominee confirmed. The special counsel investigation continues very strongly. Just yesterday, had a federal judge vacate the plea agreement with Paul Manafort, saying that Paul Manafort did lie, and a condition of the plea agreement for a lesser sentence was that he wouldn't lie subsequent to signing the agreement, and would be truthful in the comments he had offered the special prosecutor and probably the grand jury. The president is going to Hanoi. Now, Jane Fonda went to Hanoi. Of course, that was during the war. But the president is going to Hanoi on the end of this month. What will happen there is really kind of up in the air at this point. The feeling is usually heads of state and heads of governments don't get together in a highly visible summit unless their subordinates have worked out a deal ahead of time, or at least they're close enough to a deal that the closers come in and just push it one way or the other. And so probably some progress will be made with the North Koreans. Will it be the big deal? Most think not. Certainly the CIA and doesn't think it will. They've reported that to Congress. They think the North Korean regime is adamantly committed to keeping nuclear weapons as regime security for them, but we'll see. Big thing coming up. March 1 is the deadline the president put on the Chinese to reach a deal with him, or he would increase the tariffs on the Chinese. Now there's some talk that maybe that would be extended by 60 days or so, because the Chinese have moved only so far. There's a big high-level delegation in China right now trying to narrow the gap. The gap appears to be, as we've discussed before in this class, China is happy to buy more American goods. China is happy to say it won't steal technology. China is not happy to change their basic economic system. And how you change the third and how you enforce the second point. It's easy if you're buying more goods, you can determine that. How you handle, not stealing trade secrets. If you can't, maybe you don't require them from your joint ventures, but what if you steal them in the back door? Does it make any difference how you get them? If you get the same technology, so how do you enforce that second one? And the third one, it's hard to believe the Chinese state will change having a planned economy. So we'll see who will blink on that, or will they reach a conference committee type of deal? You get something you want, I get something I want, there's something I don't like, something you don't like. But how do you then declare that the best trade deal ever? I don't know, because the president will want it. Trade deficit with China in recent years, they're starting to stabilize. Because China, one, their economy is slowing down, and two, they can buy from other places. So that, they go to the European community and buy things. What's happening in Congress? The checks and balances of our political system. Well, let's look. Gerald Seib, who is the Washington executive editor of the Wall Street Journal, had this commentary this morning on the.
As I speak, it appears that we will get past this week without there being another government shutdown because of a kind of an uneasy compromise on border security that will allow President Trump to sign a bill that funds the government. Nobody's very happy with the outcome on either side.
There's not a single one of us is going to get every single thing we want. But nobody does.
But it probably allows everybody to get past this moment and move on to other issues. So the question becomes, what will the Democrats want to do now that the dust has settled on the big border wall fight? Which is to say, now that they have a new majority in the House as of 2019, what will they use that majority for to advance their own agenda in a way they couldn't over the previous 2 years when Republicans had control of both houses of Congress? Now, a lot of the action that comes is going to be symbolic because the odds of the Democratic House agreeing with the Republican Senate on any big issues are not all that great. Nonetheless, the Democrats now have a clearer path to use their House majority to put a marker down on some issues they consider important, and I see 4 of them coming. The first one is health care. Democrats think, and Republicans, by the way, agree, agree that their emphasis on health care in the 2018 campaign is why they won back control of the House, so they want to make some marks on the health care question as well. They'll talk about lowering prescription drug prices, and Republicans want to work with them a little bit on that. But there's also going to be a kind of an internal Democratic fight on health care once the conversation gets really joined, which is to say, how aggressive do they want to be? Do they want to be as a party for a Medicare for all, government-sponsored, government-run health care program?
Well, I believe that we need Medicare for all.
I am running to declare once and for all that health care is a fundamental right. And we will deliver that right with Medicare for all.
Or for a less ambitious approach, perhaps allowing people a public option to buy into Medicare as an alternative.
The way to health care for all Americans is to have a not-for-profit system, single payer, Medicare for all, Medicaid for all, some version of that ability for everyone to get quality, affordable care and buy in so you are an owner. It is yours, it is an earned benefit, and it's there for you forever.
Or simply to try to fix the Obamacare system, make it work better. So a big issue for Democrats, one they want to talk about, but one they also don't really agree on. A second issue is similar, climate change. Democrats want to put a marker down on climate change, but they have to agree, and they probably can't agree on exactly how aggressive they want to be. Do they want to embrace the so-called Green New Deal that progressives are advancing in the party, which is a very ambitious effort that has a goal of taking the country down to zero net greenhouse gas emissions in just 10 years?
This is such a major watershed moment.
Or do they want to be a little more modest about their goals because they don't want to scare off people who think that moving too aggressively could cost jobs and be harmful to business, particularly in the industrial Midwest? Third issue is infrastructure. Democrats talk about this a lot, and this is the one where there might be some room for agreement with both Republicans in the Senate and President Trump in the White House. The idea that everybody's willing and wants to spend some more money to improve the nation's infrastructure.
Both parties should be able to unite for a great rebuilding of America's crumbling infrastructure.
And fourth, investigations. This is the one that's driving President Trump crazy, obviously, but Democrats are very clear that they're going to use their majority in the House and their ability to run the relevant investigative committees in the House to continue to look at the Russian connection to the Trump 2016 campaign, to the president's own finances potentially, and to some other issues that they would like to keep on the public radar screen, and that they think the Republican House stopped them from really diving into.
We are not going to be intimidated or threatened by the president to withhold any legislative advancement. If we do our proper oversight, we're going to do our proper oversight.
This is going to be true no matter what Special Counsel Robert Mueller does in the next few weeks or months in issuing his own report. Democrats are signaling they've got their own investigative business and they're going to get to it.
So that's particularly the House of Representatives on what is emerging as an agenda. Certainly, as the report noted, Democrats in the House will focus on investigations. The committees are starting to roll now. They're staff. They have the members appointed by both parties. They have changed some of the rules. For example, the most recent rule change allowed committee staffers to take interrogatories and depositions and interrogatories without another member of Congress present, which had been a habit in the past, which will vastly expand the ability to do depositions, and of course depositions under the penalty of perjury as they administer them. The Trump world, as it was pointed out by Axios, had their first hostile hearing, and that was the issue regarding the activities of the, oh, this is another, let's see if I can even get that one time, but I have another one. The acting Attorney General Whitaker and Democrats clashed a lot on the committee. Let me see if this is one I do have. I think I have.
As you know, I am, as I mentioned, honored to serve as acting Attorney General, and I'm honored that the President selected me to be the acting Attorney General. I can assure this committee that before appointing me to this position, the President did not ask for, and I did not provide any commitments, promises concerning the Special Counsel's investigation or any other investigation, as I mentioned in my opening statement.
That's not the question I asked, sir. And I see that my time is about to expire. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to add, I know that we're going to have follow-up depositions under oath.
I'll allow
We'll add this.
I'll allow you to ask the question again more specifically and ask the witness to answer the question specifically and not to continue filibustering.
The question is whether you shared your private opinions of the special counsel investigation with President Trump, other White House officials such as John Kelly, Trump family members, public surrogates such as Rudy Giuliani. At the time that I'm referencing, you were a private citizen before you were hired, so it is not covered by executive privilege. Did you do that?
Congresswoman, just to be clear, you're asking me whether or not I talked with anybody essentially in the president's circle or at the White House about my views of the special counsel's investigation.
Correct.
When I was a private citizen
Correct.
and not at the Department of Justice?
Correct.
No, I did not.
Prior to the firing of former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, did you discuss or share your private opinions of the special counsel investigation with the Chief of Staff, Trump family members, and others? Yes or no?
As I previously answered, Congresswoman.
Yes or no, sir?
As I previously answered, Congresswoman, I have not
Yes
discussed.
or no?
As I previously answered, Congresswoman, I have not discussed.
And since you were appointed acting Attorney General, did you discuss or share your private opinions with the special counsel?
Again, the special counsel's investigation is an ongoing investigation, and I have nothing more to say than what I've already said.
So you are denying reports that you shared many one-on-one calls with President Trump and his then Chief of Staff, John Kelly, when Jeff Sessions was still Attorney General?
Again, Congressman, is there someone that provides you the basis for that question, or is that an anonymously sourced
I am asking
article?
the question, sir. Answer the question, yes or no.
Could you repeat the question, please?
So you are denying the reports that you shared many one-on-one calls with President Trump and then his Chief of Staff, John Kelly? Are you denying that, yes or no?
Congresswoman, as I've mentioned several times today in my opening statement and otherwise,
yes or no?
I'm not talking about the conversations that I've had with the President of the United States or his senior staff.
So as you can tell, this is going to be a long 2 years for members of the administration dealing with the House investigators on various committees. Let's see, go back to here. Of course, the president says Democrats investigating him is presidential harassment. Others pointed out, as a candidate and as president, he's called for 18 investigations of his opponents by the judiciary, by the judicial, like that, by the Justice Department, 18 investigations by the Justice Department, or congressional investigators when the Republicans controlled the House. So it is one of these issues, they say in Washington, D.C., where you sit is where you stand on the issue. If you control the investigators, you think it's great. If you don't, you think it's harassment. The president said no one is being investigated as many times as he has. If you look at the number of days spent on a congressional investigation and one investigative day, if you had two committees investigating the administration that day, it would be 2 days. Not surprisingly, President Nixon was highly investigated, but so was President Reagan. President Carter was highly investigated, and that's when his party controlled the Congress. So it's hard to say that this is nothing more than what the role of the Congress is. Doyle McManus of the LA Times basically said in a column, opinion column, he said the scope of the House actions can be seen in one light as pre-impeachment, getting the data necessary to provide articles of impeachment in detail, even if they can't be, the president won't be removed in the Senate, but provide House Democrats. We'll see. That seems to me to be at one end of the spectrum, but we'll see. Okay. The House yesterday did something interesting. They approved a resolution, has to be approved by the Senate now, that may or may not, and probably won't do it in the same form, that basically said, let's end our aid to the Saudis in the war in Yemen. That's a direct, does two things. One, it talks about limiting the scope of a conflict involving American personnel, but two, it is the latest indication that a large block of Congress, and not just Democrats, but some Republicans too, are very concerned about our relationship with Saudi Arabia at this time, and particularly the Saudi Crown Prince. The president has refused to do a report on the death of that one journalist that was required by Congress, so we'll see how Congress will pursue that. Then, and I can't do a fair presentation of this today at this class, but I will next class. And that is probably one of the more ambitious Democratic objectives, which is called the Green New Deal. And think of the New Deal with an environmental focus that still has jobs, still has changes in the economic structuring of income. Think of it as including health care and doing it on an accelerated pace. The Green New Deal. Republicans have jumped on that because what was introduced in the House and the Senate was a broad resolution, a framework of what it might be without the level of details that in many ways can determine whether it's too far-reaching or just aspirational. There was some confusion on a website in terms of the FAQ that were not directly related to the current version of the resolution. The conservative media leaked on it. We'll talk more at the next class on that. We'll do some fact-checking too. Senator McConnell, sensing that some more moderate Democrats don't want to be on record for something they don't know all the details yet, has decided to bring this up for a vote right now. That's the way they used to bring up the president's budget for a vote. If the president's budget had anything unfriendly, his other party would just bring it up and force his party members to vote on it, and usually it would, die 90-10 or something like that. We'll see, that probably will happen. But we'll go back on Green New Deal. I think that and Medicare for All are things that are going to be very much part of the landscape in the next 2 years. Let's talk about the landscape in the next 2 years. For those of you who are making your plane reservations to Iowa and New Hampshire, and particularly your hotel reservations, the Holiday Inn Express goes way up come caucus and primary time in Iowa and in New Hampshire. So you get your reservation in early. We're only 369 days ahead of those elections now, both the Iowa caucus and the start of mail-in voting on the California primary. So let's take a look at it again. Remember, to win the president, you have to get presidency, you need 270 electoral votes. The one person pointed out, since the Republicans have a majority of the delegations in the House of Representatives, they actually, and if no one gets a majority of electoral college, it goes to the House of Representatives, which votes by delegation. So not by the number of Congress members you have. The Republicans have an edge there, so Republicans need 269 electoral votes. Democrats need 270 electoral votes to win. And you think that's a curious thing. Remember, I think it was 2 of the Clinton, maybe 3 of the Clinton electoral votes said they weren't going to vote for in the last election because for different reasons. Okay, we had a number of additional candidates. Elizabeth Warren moved from an exploratory committee to full candidate mode in the past week. It worked at home. Okay. She kicked off her campaign. She had a big crowd. Cory Booker, launched his campaign. The New Jersey U.S. Senator. The one that...
A headline-grabbing former mayor with a love of social media who says he's the only vegan in Senate history.
Thank you for a vegan mecca.
Senator Cory Booker is throwing his hat in the ring for President of the United States.
I'm in this race to try to build our nation up.
So, who is he?
Cory Booker, nice move.
Booker is a former college football player and Yale Law School graduate.
Mayor Booker, for those who don't know,
He became a national figure as mayor of Newark by bringing in money and attention to the city.
A $100 million challenge grant.
And in 2013, he was elected to the Senate.
Thank you, New Jersey!
Booker is known for coming to his constituents' rescue, literally.
The building next door is on fire.
Yes.
And your first instinct was to go in?
Yeah.
He ran into the burning building and up the stairs.
Also his upbeat attitude.
Lead with love.
And his public speaking.
This is about the closest I'll probably ever have in my life to an I am Spartacus moment.
Some of Booker's priorities? So far, criminal justice reform. And he's also likely to focus on racial and gender equality and marijuana legalization. He's been in the Senate for a while, but he doesn't have many signature legislative accomplishments. Booker also has ties to Wall Street, something that might be an issue for the party's more progressive wing. So how has he taken on President Trump? Booker has been one of Trump's most aggressive critics in the Senate.
And it is a failure.
For Booker, the Trump presidency poses a
moral moment in our nation.
But this approach may fall flat with Democrats, who are energized by their anger toward Trump. For his part, President Trump has said this.
I mean, take a look at Cory Booker. He ran Newark, New Jersey into the ground. He was a horrible mayor.
So what are his chances? So far, he's polling in the middle of the assumed pack, but it's pretty early. Booker's been building a national profile for a while. He's already traveled to many states that could be key to winning the White House.
Today put him in their very initial rankings as in the top 5, I think, among the Democratic Democratic candidates so far. Also, Amy Klobuchar, in a snowstorm in Wisconsin, announced her candidate. No website video for her. She was out on it. That's a Washington Post video, so I can't show that. She is known for her testimony in the Senate, the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh as being a respectful but assertive questioner. Here's a profile also from the New York Times on her.
A Minnesota senator known for her folksy style.
My pork chop on a stick.
Who's not afraid of the cold.
Snowstorm and ready to vote.
Senator Amy Klobuchar is joining the race for President of the United States. So who is she? Klobuchar grew up in the Minneapolis suburbs.
Here's my house where I grew up.
The daughter of a school teacher and a newspaper columnist. She became a corporate lawyer before transitioning to politics and was elected district attorney for the state's most populous county.
We've gone after scam artists, child abusers, murderers.
Klobuchar ran for the Senate in 2006 and won. She's since earned a reputation as a worker bee.
You have been ranked as first on a list of all 100 senators with the most bills that have been enacted into law.
She's also known for being a difficult boss and has one of the highest staff turnover rates in the Senate. Klobuchar gained national attention during the Kavanaugh hearings.
Drinking is one thing, but the concern is about truthfulness.
And even wound up being parodied on SNL.
Did you ever drink too many beers?
You mean, was I cool? Yeah.
She isn't a centrist, but she hasn't embraced some of the party's most progressive ideas either. Some recent priorities: lowering the cost of prescription drugs, addressing sexual harassment, and protecting online privacy.
Companies have to do all they can to protect the information of the people that are part of their platforms.
And President Trump? Klobuchar says he hasn't risen to the job.
We need someone in the White House that's a hero for their time.
So far, she doesn't seem to really be on his radar.
Thank you as well to Senator Amy Klobuchar.
And the polls? Early numbers put her near the bottom of the pack, for now. But some Democrats hope Klobuchar's Midwestern roots and track record of bipartisanship will have broad appeal.
Encourages whether or not you're willing to stand next to someone you don't always agree with for the betterment of this country.
If anything, she is one of the most talked about candidates at this point, punching well beyond her poll numbers. More than one publication has run a headline like this, because she comes right from that Midwest that Hillary Clinton lost, and she's been a very popular U.S. senator. Now, unfortunately, even some conservative media, like the Wall Street Journal, said she's almost a dream candidate for Democrats, though they disagree with many of her ideas. In Minnesota, she runs at the top of the pack. She was one of the most popular senators against the other party members in the recent Senate elections. So we now have this group of potential Democratic candidates in the blue, and potential Republican candidates, including Governor Hogan, former Governor Kasich, and Senator Ben Sasse from the Midwest. What state is he? Nebraska. And this week we saw signs of life from Booker by his announcement, Klobuchar by her announcement in the snow, Warren by her announcement with a good crowd. Senator Brown from Ohio is itching closer and closer to running, and Beto O'Rourke had a great time on Monday with the 10,000, not the 203 or 300 persons that the president said he had. And he was gone from, being somewhat, looked like he peaked after his Texas election to now right back in the middle of the focus on the debate. We'll talk about sizing up candidates next time. Okay, I want to talk about this man, John Dingell. First a clip, and then I want to read something to you that I thought was very good.
In 1955, Dwight Eisenhower was president. A stamp cost 3 cents, and John Dingell of Michigan was elected to Congress in the same Detroit district his father represented for 22 years. 11 men would pass through the Oval Office by the time Dingell retired in 2015. He served 59 years, longer than anyone in American history. When he broke the record, Nancy Pelosi and Democrats literally did a happy dance, but his legacy is far more than longevity. A longtime champion of health care like his father, when Lyndon Johnson led the drive to pass Medicare in 1965, Dingell was such a key strategist the president invited him to the Truman Library, where it was signed into law. Gruff, even snarky, some colleagues liked him, some didn't, but all agreed it was better to have him on your side. With biting wit, he always found a way to get an opponent's goat, and he took quickly to the new craze, Twitter. Constantly at odds with the Senate, he once tweeted, "I've been trying to repeal and replace the Senate since 1955. No luck." Donald Trump was a favorite target. After the president shared a foul mood on Twitter, Dingell tweeted, "The Greens must be tricky today." But in the hours before he died, he told his wife, Debbie, some occasions deserve more than 280 characters, and he dictated a remarkable series of reflections. Recalling the great battles he had been part of, medical care, cleaning up the environment, regulating dangerous products, and civil rights, he said, "We observed modicums of respect even as we fought, often bitterly and savagely, over issues that were literally life and death. The work is not finished," he said. "We've made progress, and we did it with the support of Democrats and Republicans who consider themselves first and foremost to be Americans." It was a summation of the credo that marked his long career. With his father, who came before him, and his wife, who was elected to succeed him, the Dingles have represented Michigan in Congress for 86 years and counting.
I remember John Dingell when I was part of I staffed a group of negotiators from the U.S. Conference of Mayors when I was working for city government, in which we wanted to amend a bill by the cable television industry that would restrict local governments from fostering community television efforts. And the bill had flown through the Senate and got over to the House of Representatives, and the subcommittee chairman had already endorsed the bill as it came over. And it only had one more step, and it was a well-lobbied bill by the industry. And apart from the merits, I remember this. When it reached John Dingell's committee, some of his cities in his district reached out to him and said, "We need your help before this bill goes through." And he reminded the cable industry, as he had reminded many before, that you may have the votes, but I have the gavel. And this bill is not going to go out until we have an opportunity to try to reach a deal. And eventually we did. In various parts of the nation, we eventually did that. So he did this remarkable statement. I remember having the opportunity to briefly talk to him during that time. He dictated a message to his wife the day before he died. Think about that. How do you do that? How do you do that? I mean, obviously, it wasn't dementia he was dying of. And in part, he said this: "One of the advantages to knowing that your demise is imminent and that reports of it will not be greatly exaggerated is that you have a few moments to compose some parting thoughts. My personal and political character was formed in a different era that was kinder, if not necessarily gentler. We observed modicums of respect even as we fought." Think about it. All that's been accomplished. Impoverishment of the elderly because of medical expenses was a common and often accepted occurrence. Opponents of the Medicare program that saved the elderly from the cruel fate called socialized medicine. Remember that slander if there's a sustained revival of that silly red baiting today. Not 5 decades ago, much of the larger group of freshwater lakes on Earth, our own Great Lakes, were closed to swimming and fishing and other recreational pursuits because of chemicals and bacterial contamination from untreated industrial and wastewater disposal. Today, the Great Lakes are so hospitable to marine life that one of the biggest challenges is controlling the invasive species that have come to find a new home. We regularly use and consume foods, drugs, chemicals, and other things that were legal, promoted, and actively harmful. Hazardous wastes were dumped on empty plots in the dead of night. There were few, if any, restrictions on industrial emissions. We had only the barest scientific knowledge of the long-term consequences of any of this. And there was the great stain on America in the form of our legacy of racial discrimination. There were good people of all colors who banded together, risking and even losing their lives to erase the legal and other barriers that held America down. In their time, they were often demonized and targeted, much like other vulnerable men and women today. Please note, all of these challenges were addressed by Congress. Maybe not as fast as we wanted or as perfectly as we hoped. The work is certainly not finished, but we made progress. And in every case, from the passage of Medicare to the passage of civil rights, we did it with the support of Democrats and Republicans who consider themselves first and foremost to be American. In my life and career, I've often heard it that so-and-so has real power, as in the powerful chairman of the XYZ committee. It's an expression that has always grated on me. In democratic government, elected officials do not have power. They hold power in trust for the people who elected them. if they misuse or abuse that public trust, it is quite properly revoked, and the quicker the better. As I prepare to leave this all behind, I'll now leave you in control of the greatest nation of mankind and pray God gives you the wisdom to understand the responsibility you hold in your hands. May God bless you all, and may God bless America. Whatever you think about John Deagle's partisanship, I think we can all agree on the message. And even as we look at this very challenging presidency in which half of America is on one side and 40 to 45% on the other side, and 5% keeps going back and forth. Sometimes compromise, goodwill, and keeping an eye on the greater American interests is what we all want in our elected officials. Have a good day.